Hey, how are we doing, everybody, and welcome back into the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and today, as we finally make our way towards the end of this crazy NFL Week 9 with all the news, all of the injuries, all of the COVID cases, all the stuff that's been going on, it's almost game time. We've almost arrived at Sunday, and it's almost time for that big game slate with all of our favorite teams playing for this week. I can't wait to get into action and then obviously get this whole week-long video lineup kicked off for Week 10. But today, in this episode, we're going to be talking some rest of season wide receiver rankings, my top 24 players as they are today here for this 2021 NFL season. We update this list every 2 weeks, so bi-weekly here. In the week in between, we do the running back. So every other week here on Thursday or Friday mornings, we alternate either a rest of season running back or rest of season wide receivers episode, which we're going to be getting into in today's video. So with that being said, drop down, give today's video a like before we get started, help others out there find our content, and click that subscribe button if you're new around here so we can keep this community growing. With that being said, let's hit the intro and get right in to our first wide receiver. Alrighty, here, kicking things off in today's episode with our number one overall wide receiver for the rest of this fantasy season. Who else would it be at this point? Cooper Kupp has been the most dominating wide receiver in the National Football League this season. And man, did anyone see this thing coming? I thought Cooper Kupp was in for a really nice year. I thought him and Matthew Stafford were going to have a very productive season. But I could have never predicted the heights of which Cooper Kupp will be out here making plays and having impacts in our fantasy lineups. He's coming off of his lowest target outing of the NFL season, in which he was thrown 9 passes. 9 targets was his worst game this year in terms of opportunities to catch the football. He still took that for over 100 yards and a touchdown this past week against the Texans. He's been unstoppable. Him and Matthew Stafford, the chemistry that those two have together, they've developed throughout this season. It's really, really strong. Kupp's been making plays all over the field, scoring touchdowns in the red zone, averaging 22.6 points per game. It's all there. He's caught 90 or more receiving yards in 7 out of his 8 contests this season. And like I said, 9+ targets every week. Without this past week in consideration, he's double-digit targets every game this year. Cooper Kupp, the clear and concise wide receiver 1, moving his way up the list. Tyreek Hill here at the number 2 spot over Davante Adams, who we're going to get into in just a second here. Tyreek Hill still has Patrick Mahomes playing the quarterback position. That's still elite level quarterback connectivity between these two players, despite the fact that Pat has been playing less clean football in terms of his turnovers than he has in the past. Tyreek's still one of the only players in the National Football League that can touch the ball and take it from anywhere on the field to the house in an instant. He's got lightning quick speed. We all know that. They call him the cheetah for a reason. And he's got such a unique skill set, something that was really encouraging to see last week and something that Tyreek has really evolved over the course of his career in, is that he's not just a home run hitter. Last week he had 18 targets. That is a ton of opportunities to catch the football, and where he did his damage against the Giants was run after catch, getting the ball flipped out quick to him in the flats, and getting the job done running with the football after the catch was already made. He's got a lot of games this season with really nice volume, 12+ targets in 5 contests this season. And again, back in Week 8 here this past week on Monday Night Football, 18 targets against the Giants. So we know he can score in a flash. He can have a one-play touchdown for 75 yards. He's more than capable of doing that. He's got a great ceiling. The target share he's getting is giving him a great floor. And we've almost seen the tables turn a little bit from last season, whereas I think that it was safe to say Travis Kelce was Pat Mahomes' favorite target. This year, things are swaying a little bit more in Tyreek Hill's direction, so I like him at this number 2 spot. Davante Adams of my Green Bay Packers here is my number 3 wide receiver on the list, taking a slide, plain and simple. He doesn't have Aaron Rodgers for what looks like potentially the next 2 contests here. He's not going to have him this weekend against Pat Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. Downgrading your quarterback play, no matter how good Jordan Love is or isn't, whatever his potential might be, this is start number 1 and start number 2 if Rodgers can't play against Seattle the week after we're posting this episode, which would be either Jordan Love versus Geno Smith, or potentially if Rodgers decides he wants to come back because he's eligible to return to team facilities on that Saturday, we could see Russell off of his finger issue, playing Rodgers off of COVID for a whatever that matchup would look like. It would be very interesting to see. Both quarterbacks obviously having some potential rust at play. But with that being said, Davante Adams, when you take a player of Aaron Rodgers' caliber, a thrower of the football with the ball placement, the chemistry, the connectivity he has with Davante Adams, even if young quarterback Jordan Love laser focuses in and dials up a ton of passes in Adams' way, the accuracy will not be there. The consistency of catchable balls will not be there. I watched Jordan Love with my own two eyes at Packers training camp this offseason. One throw would be the greatest thing you've ever seen, and he would show flashes of being a superstar talent. And then the next pass would be an absolute wobbler, would be off target by 5 yards, and you would wonder how the safety doesn't come down with that every single time. It hasn't been a consistent process to him yet, and again, we haven't seen him outside of a couple preseason games in this NFL season. There's a lot to uncover here. Davante Adams the next 2 weeks doesn't have Aaron Rodgers. Maybe deep diving a little bit into this more than I need to, but Davante will get Aaron back down the stretch, and after that, he is the clear number one option in this Packers offense. He's going to be peppered in targets. They're very dependent on him in the pass game. At number 4 here, I've got Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. And if you've been watching the channel, you have heard me rant about his connection and chemistry with Joe Burrow. These two are so good that they literally have not missed on a contest yet this season. Jamar Chase has 10.5 or more fantasy points in every single outing this year in half PPR scoring. And last week, being that lowest amount of production and output for him, at that 10.5 point marker, he only caught 3 of his 9 targets and scored a touchdown. So him and Joe Burrow are going to get the job done pretty much every week here. I've penciled him in for 1 to 2 dud performances throughout the rest of the year as a insurance policy here. But the safety in the floor has been so excellent. The ceiling we have all seen is exceptional. What these two do on the deep ball is unprecedented for a young quarterback and wide receiver at this early of a time in their NFL careers. But that LSU chemistry has really translated into the NFL. Jamar Chase, he's unstoppable at the number 4 spot. A.J. Brown, my biggest riser for this week, soars into the number 5 spot for me. This has to do with what happens throughout the course of a fantasy season. Situations, overall, the build and the formation of this Titans offense, the landscape has been entirely changed here. No Derrick Henry means this team, whether they like it or not, is going to be forced and going to have their hand played in a way that they have to throw the football more. They don't have an option. Jeremy McNichols and Adrian Peterson at age 36 can't make up for the best pure rushing threat in the National Football League. Derrick Henry's value to this team goes without saying, and it's almost hard to put into words just how important he was to this organization. Ryan Tannehill's going to have to drop back and pass more. It's plain and simple. Even if they run the ball 30 times a game still, they're not going to have the efficiency and break off these 75-yard touchdown runs that Derrick Henry was getting and almost emulating the big splash plays of the receiving game, because as a rusher, he's just talented enough to make those huge runs happen with his talent. A.J. Brown's going to get a lot of footballs thrown his way here. I hate the schedule the next 2 weeks. Los Angeles and New Orleans, those could be 2 stingier matchups. I'm really, in particular, worried about this weekend against the Rams. But after that, Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Miami, and Houston twice. Very, very exploitable matchups. Very good opportunities. Again, if Tannehill has to dial up the passing attempts, A.J. Brown should be in for a successful end to this season. Deebo Samuel here of the San Francisco 49ers. What did we say last time around? I want to see him do it on a more consistent basis, meaning I want a larger sample size to see him keep putting up these gaudy numbers. He did it. Deebo Samuel, he's explosive. He's a great talent. I think the 49ers need to diversify their ball distribution across the football field a little bit better here, because right now I think they're too dependent on Deebo Samuel in the passing game. I think Ayuk needs to get more involved when George Kittle comes back. He's back at practice. We'll see if he plays here in the very near future. I think they got to get those players the ball, because if they have any hopes of making the postseason, if they have any hopes of taking steps forward as a team, really good defensive coordinators and really good personnel-wise franchises and organizations on the defensive side of the ball can just take Deebo Samuel away. So try and get other people involved here to divert attention away from him. He's super efficient. You give him the ball at the line of scrimmage, you throw him a deep pass, he can make plays all over the field. An excellent route runner, super good after the catch, can put his shoulder down and punish defensive backs. Deebo Samuel at number 6, his production has been fantastic. 13.5 or more fantasy points in 6 out of his 7 performances so far in 2021. Stefon Diggs moves down the list. Why? Like an A.J. Brown, a Deebo Samuel, a Jamar Chase, he has not shown similar ceilings to those players. Those players have earned their status at the top of this list because not only have they been consistent, but they've been consistently great. Stefon Diggs has been consistent to a point so far this season, and he's put up numbers that have been impressive and that have been starting in top-end quality wide receiver 1 numbers, but he hasn't quite cracked those very, very upper echelon points. He's only dropped below 10 points in half PPR scoring in 2 out of his 7 performances. But the 2020 numbers we saw from Diggs, the 3 touchdown games, the games where his yardage totals were closer to 150, 160 than they were to 100, those games haven't been present yet. He's still got Josh Allen as his quarterback. I love the situation in Buffalo. I think those two are an incredibly well-made match, and I think that they can put up excellent numbers and maybe even give us a couple of those performances. But Allen's progression as a player has allowed him to make smarter choices, distribute the football more around the football field, and get other players opportunities and chances in this offense. That's taken away from Diggs a little bit in fantasy. He's still an excellent player, a wide receiver 1, just not quite in that elite tier anymore. Justin Jefferson, someone who slid down the list slightly for me here. He's got a little bit of a tougher back-end schedule during the fantasy playoffs, which makes him slide lower than a Stefon Diggs or even, he doesn't quite have the ceiling of a Deebo Samuel either. But Jefferson's still in a situation I really, really like. A balanced offense. He's got a wide receiver opposite of him who can keep a defense's respect and attention from doubling Justin Jefferson every play. He's got the Rams in Green Bay in week 16 and 17. That means potentially having Jair Alexander, who's one of the best cover corners in the league, back shadowing Justin Jefferson by that time. And then the Rams, obviously, Jalen Ramsey is in that matchup. So 2 really tough games during the fantasy semifinal and final that if you have Jefferson, that might be a little bit of an eye-opener for you. But other than that, Justin Jefferson putting up fantastic numbers. He's only been under 9.5 fantasy points in 1 out of his 7 games, so his floor is very, very high, very desirable here. Get him the football. We know what he can do. Justin Jefferson was essentially last year's Jamar Chase, and we're seeing how that played out. Super talented player for the Vikings. DK Metcalf at the number 9 spot for the Seattle Seahawks. You could probably argue that he could go at this number 8 spot ahead of a Justin Jefferson because DK Metcalf's ceiling has arguably been better. DK, if you look at the raw numbers, you might not even realize that Russell Wilson was gone for the time that he was injured with that finger. Him and Geno Smith got the job done. DK Metcalf was making explosive plays, scoring touchdowns. He tied his lowest point output of the season in the first start for Geno Smith, but that was still 8 points. Half PPR scoring again, but you'll take 8 points over 3, like we'll get into with some of these other players who have a lot lower floors. DK's going to come out here on bye week right now. They've got Green Bay next week. Maybe Russell Wilson's back, maybe not. I think he'll be just fine, though. DK finds a way to get his numbers. He's a huge body to throw the football to in the red zone. Super explosive, imposes his will after the catch. He brings basically everything to the table you could ask of him. And again, the fantasy ceiling is excellent on a week-to-week basis. Ceedee Lamb at the number 10 spot. One quick point of importance is Ceedee did sustain an ankle sprain at practice this week, which could potentially nag him down the stretch here and play some sort of an issue. But from the sounds of it, he came back and was in a limited fashion. Will practice limited the rest of this week. So sounds like he's going to be okay. Sounds like he should be able to play through that. But something worth noting here. I love this Dallas offense. Super balanced. Sounds like we're getting Dak Prescott back this week. The ability for them to have a two-headed monster at the running back position sets up the play-action game awesome for this team. And with CeeDee's versatility to run routes at an elite level outside or in the slot, him and Dak Prescott, They've got chemistry. Ceedee gets his separation, makes his big plays. They bring basically everything to the table you could want here. And again, Dak Prescott, we didn't have him last week. We had Cooper Rush against the Vikings on Sunday Night Football. But moving forward here, Dak said he's got 2 good days of practice underneath him. It's safe to say he's going to be back in the lineup here, giving Ceedee those fantastic point totals. DeAndre Hopkins. This is one we've been on for maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4 weeks at this point, talking about as a sell candidate for this season because we started to see the early signs of de-evolution from DeAndre Hopkins. And now we're going to reflect on the rankings here as we've started to see that play out. And it was rather unfortunate events that carried this about a lot quicker and more promptly than was expected. But D-Hop's dealing with a hamstring injury that has bothered him and nagged him throughout this season. It's impacted him in multiple contests this year, either reduced his snap count and kept him off the field. He starts the game and doesn't finish it, that being the case against the Packers on Thursday Night Football last week. Or, in addition to that, you've got the fact that Kyler Murray's now banged up, and he has not been practicing, nor has D-Hop this week. So you're potentially, and we saw this happen last year, you're potentially already limiting the upside Kyler Murray brings to the table, which is crucial. That's critical. The quarterback you have passing to your wide receiver is a lot of and that brings to the table a lot of the potential that your wide receiver has to produce for your fantasy team. If Kyler Murray can't be running all over the place because of his play style, getting outside the pocket and playmaking, that's going to reduce the upside D-Hop has to make plays downfield and to be a big splash impact player. Again, with D-Hop's injury, hamstrings don't just go away overnight. He almost would have to be shut down for a week, not play, and truly get this thing right before I'd feel good about that situation. And even before any of this, on top of that is the fact that he's been touchdown dependent this year. His targets are way down from where they were at in 2020 with Kyler Murray under center, who is, to his credit and for the benefit of this football team, spreading it out more around this offense. But Kyler has not been laser focused on D-Hop like he was in 2020. So there were signs of regression, signs for drawback for D-Hop before this week, but with now the injuries sustained to Kyler Murray and the re-aggravation and flaring up of DeAndre Hopkins' hamstring, those are both red flags that impact him moving down on this list today. Next up, Diontae Johnson here. So this is someone I'm probably a bit ahead of in terms of the consensus out there and the other fantasy outlets that you might consume information from. Diontae, someone I would expect that I am higher on with my ranking of him here at the number 12 position in the last wide receiver one in 12-team leagues. I absolutely love what this guy brings to the table. You're giving me double-digit targets nearly every week. In 5 out of his 6 performances, he has 10 or more. And you're giving me a player who can win routes at every single level of a defense. Big Ben's hit him deep this year, and he peppers him underneath and near the line of scrimmage with that dynamic of this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. I love what Diontae gives you every week. Again, he is the top wide receiver in the Steelers offensive passing game. The floor is so safe, and he gives you a little bit of ceiling as well. There's no reason you would really ever consider sitting him because of how many balls Big Ben is going to force feed him. Even if he's really not that open, Ben still throws him the ball. So Diontae Johnson here, someone who is dependable as long as he's healthy every single week to get you X amount of points, X amount of targets. It's fantastic. Diontae Johnson's my number 12 player. Next up, your Mike Evans at the number 13 spot. Mike is a player who has also risen up today's episode, or up the board in today's episode, along with teammate Chris Godwin, who we'll talk about in just a second here. The main reason for Mike Evans' increase in ranking is because we don't know exactly when AB is going to be back on the field. Bruce Arians has talked about this could potentially be a long-term issue for the team. And so far, without Antonio Brown on the field and with Gronk have missing time in the recent past here, he returned to action this past week but then was knocked out with back spasms. Evans and Godwin's production has been up. Evans has a 10-target game with 6 receptions, 76 yards, and 3 TDs in the first contest without Antonio Brown on the field. And then last week, Evans scored a touchdown as well, despite the fact that the Buccaneers struggled mightily offensively for most of that game in the absence of Brown. So you're giving me a higher ceiling and a better floor when Antonio's not on the field, because Antonio Brown on a per-game target basis was the most looked-to player by Tom Brady since he was acquired by the Buccaneers. That's important here. That means there's a lot more love to go around to these other players. And again, you take Gronk out of that mix as well, Godwin and Evans are getting peppered in looks. They're getting a lot more opportunities. Mike Evans is actually averaging a touchdown per game this season. Now, I will note he only has 4 games with touchdown receptions this year, which was making him a little boom or bust at the early phase of this NFL season. But he does have a 3-touchdown game, 2 2-touchdown games, and a singular standalone game with just 1 TD reception. Hopefully, he can get that more to consistently scoring us 1 touchdown down the stretch instead of completely blowing up or completely fizzling out. But that's the nature of the beast here. Mike Evans, though, his ceiling's fantastic. It seems like the Saints are the one team that keeps Brady in check to an extent during the regular season here. So with Mike still producing, having a touchdown in that matchup, that was something encouraging to see because it's going to be off to the races for the Bucs in nearly every game aside from that. DJ Moore here at the number 14 spot. DJ's a player who has really taken a back step here since the first month of the season. Back in week 4, he had a very hot 27-point performance at Dallas. In every game since then, he's had 10 points or less in half PPR. It's been, and the reason we know why, it's been that Sam Darnold has not quite produced up to the level he was through that first 3-4 game stretch, and Sam has been a little bit more inconsistent. The ball placement hasn't been as good, but he's still forcing passes to DJ Moore, which is why he stays up here on the list. Now, he's been very disappointing. We acknowledge that. DJ is someone who, if he was getting better opportunities, is the caliber of receiver who can separate, find space, get open, and make plays. Sam's just got to be better, and Sam's in concussion protocol right now, so we'll see how that plays out long-term for these guys, or not long-term, really short-term, rather, in terms of this week, but leading into the rest of these games this year, DJ's got to figure out how to get back to those ceiling numbers or at least raise that floor up a little bit here. The target floor is fantastic, but the actual productivity hasn't quite been there since that week 4 game. 7+ targets every week for DJ Moore, but leaving more points to be desired in the actual output category. Now, Mike Williams here. So this is someone who has significantly fallen down the rankings list throughout the episodes we made. I believe this is the 3rd episode we've done of rest of season rankings here for wide receivers. Maybe it's the 2nd. I think it's the 3rd, though. Mike Williams, though, is someone who we got a lot of questions. Is this production sustainable? Is Mike Williams the real deal? Will he continue to be a fantasy wide receiver 1? And there was always, amongst myself and amongst you guys, the viewers, this uncertainty and this level of uncomfortability with Mike Williams' dependability for this season. And he has shown us that those concerns were valid. And I think that Mike here can be considered a fringe wide receiver 1, if that makes sense. So a fringe wide receiver 1 is probably someone in the 11 to 14 range of the ranking, so just outside that little bubble there for 12-team leagues at the number 15 spot. The reason is because of the mass gap between Mike Williams' fantasy relevant games and the games where he is not even remotely in the realm of being a lineup-worthy player. If Mike Williams is giving us lineup-worthy points, and then looking back at his 7 contests this year, if Mike Williams was deserving of a fantasy lineup place, he scored 18 points or more in all of those contests, that being 4 weeks out of the 7. In the other 3 weeks where Mike didn't give us respectable lineup numbers, he gave us 3 points or fewer in half PPR scoring. There's no in between there. There's a 15-point swing between his fantasy relevant games and the games where he's not even on the map for a player who should be in your lineup. So, yes, inconsistency is a huge concern here. He's boom or bust. He can win you your weeks, absolutely, but that has to be taken into consideration with the rankings here. Right now, he's 4-3. He's in favor. He's got more productive games than not, but this is something that it's becoming a little bit eerie, a little bit nerve-wracking, and you don't know if you can trust him. Off a bye last week against the Pats. Very quiet game. That's a tough defense, though. This week, Philadelphia, another challenge. We'll learn more about Mike Williams here in Week 9. Chris Godwin here at the number 16 spot. Now, we're not going to spend too much time with this one because we talked about Mike Evans in pretty good detail, but Chris is the same situation. No Antonio Brown on the field. That clearly is an advantageous thing for Godwin, and the expectation at least right now, is that this is a longer-term injury for Antonio Brown. Who knows what the chances of him returning off the bye are at this point, because Bruce Arians kind of left a cloudy picture out there about what the actual situation is for Antonio's health long-term. But as long as Antonio Brown is out of this lineup, Chris Godwin is probably a top 12 lineup play on a week-to-week basis. But if Antonio was to return, there would be a very noticeable drop-off in both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin's weekly production output. And that doesn't mean they're bad players. That doesn't mean they're not super highly talented athletes, Pro Bowl level players. That just means that Antonio Brown, who, again, is one of Tom's most targeted players on a per-game basis since being acquired by the Buccaneers, that's something that has to be taken into consideration and placed value upon here down the stretch of the season. So while AB's out of the lineup, Chris Godwin is clearly higher than the 16th best fantasy wide receiver. I would say I would probably play him right now, or not necessarily play him, but expect more points out of him than a Mike Williams, a DJ Moore, some of those other names on a per-game basis until AB returns to the lineup. But for that time being, again, we're going to hang tight here with Godwin at 16, but obviously an excellent play. Keenan Allen at the number 17 spot. This is one where Keenan doesn't have the same ceiling that Mike Williams has on a week-to-week basis. He hasn't even been close to putting up the top-end numbers we've seen from Mike Williams, but Keenan also hasn't laid the extreme level of eggs that Mike Williams has. His floor is unquestionably safer than Mike Williams, and again, his ceiling, though, is also lower. So Keenan's got 8 or more targets in 6 out of 7 games this year. We talked about how throughout this offseason, and this season it's remained true as well. The route running's fantastic. You can still see the chemistry developed between him and Justin Herbert. I love the quarterback. It's hard to fail in the situation when you're this good of a player and you're in such a advantageous area for the wide receiver position with a young quarterback who's developing and clearly has shown elite flashes of potential this season. So I think Keenan, going back to Mike Williams, both will be very productive fantasy lineup plays the rest of the way this year. Expect more consistency and more reliability from Keenan Allen, but expect a lower ceiling than that of Mike Williams. Terry McLaurin here, back to a player who is a lot more boom or bust than you would typically like to see out of a wide receiver. He is a similar situation to a Mike Williams, but not quite to such an extreme extent. He's got 3 games with 21 plus fantasy points, 2 games where he hit 8 points right on the head, and then everything else is underneath that marker. So it's been less of a Terry McLaurin problem, more of a QB play issue, as opposed to you look at a Mike Williams and you see the check next to the QB box. It turns into matchup and given weekly performance. But Terry McLaurin is one of the best wide receivers in the league from route running, athleticism, ability to win catches on contested balls, and the ability to have elite red zone awareness. I love Terry McLaurin as a player. If he could just stabilize, and it's out of his control, but if he could get more stabilized QB play, he would be closer to 12 than he is to 20 right now. So Scary Terry, the ceiling is great the rest of the way this season. You're not always going to be able to rely on his fantasy floor, but he's a weekly lineup play, someone you got to trust in his upside. Michael Pittman, a new face on the rankings list for today's video. His upward trajectory over the past few weeks here has been very, very fun to watch, very, very impressive. He's arrived, and despite the fact that he hasn't quite reached the upper level of fantasy wide receiver tiers to this point, he's still in a situation where I think his quarterback, although Carson Wentz is a reckless player, his play style plays to the benefit of Michael Pittman's fantasy value. He throws up passes to him downfield, gives him jump ball, big play opportunities, and throws him the football where it counts down the red zone and gives him opportunities to score touchdowns. Michael Pittman's target share has also been a little bit of a variable, a wild card on a week-to-week basis. We saw that number start the season out very high, then it kind of tapered off a bit, and now we're starting to trend upwards a little bit now. Pittman's someone I believe in over the course of the rest of this season. I think as long as Carson Wentz is healthy, the quarterback in Indianapolis, this is somebody that can benefit greatly from having a QB who's a gunslinger and will chuck the ball 60 yards downfield to him once or twice a game. And you again, one more comment on Pittman. You give yourself a wide receiver that's 6'4", has his frame, he's going to come down with a lot of those footballs. Amari Cooper at number 20 here for the Dallas Cowboys. This is a lesser version of Ceedee Lamb in the sense that it's a great situation, another excellent wide receiver and great player. He has just taken a slight back seat to Ceedee, and with this offense becoming more balanced this year, that's meant less volume, less passing attempts for Amari Cooper and Ceedee Lamb to absorb here with Dallas. And that ultimately has lowered Amari Cooper's floor a little bit. The ceiling is still fantastic. But just like, again, I'll go back to another example of a Terry McLaurin. You're talking more boom or bust than you are a consistent floor with an additional ceiling tacked on top. Amari Cooper's got 4 games with 13.5 or more fantasy points. But other than that, shaky performances. It's fine, though. We're at the end of this list. You can't really expect the floors for these players to be excellent. But Amari gives you a ceiling. That's what's valuable here. He could win you a week if he goes out as your wide receiver 2 in your lineup, has one of those boom games, makes a big play. Dak will throw him a couple long balls, and we saw him make the game-winning touchdown reception last week. He's a fun player, Amari Cooper, a high upside wide receiver 2 with a little bit unreliable floor. Robert Woods is kind of the opposite. Robert's ceiling has taken a major hit this year because Cooper Kupp's ascension and assertion to being the best wide receiver in fantasy has eaten into his workload a little bit. But as a talented player, as a highly competent and capable athlete, Robert Woods has managed to keep his fantasy value afloat after a rough start to this season. 5 straight games for Robert Woods with a floor of 10 or more fantasy points. He does have one boom game in there against Seattle where he caught a ton of passes, saw double-digit targets, and racked up well over 100 yards receiving. But outside of that, you're looking at a player who's just being efficient, scoring touchdowns, and getting valuable targets in the red zone. Robert Woods is not someone to expect to go out here and win your matchups and your weeks for you on a given per-week basis. But he is someone you can rely on as a safe floor play and someone who will go out there and at least give you a steady amount of points scored. Adam Thielen. This guy is a touchdown magician. As much as I might not want to have him on here because he is very touchdown dependent, he has shown that touchdowns are a dependable part of his weekly fantasy projection and outlook. He's got 6 touchdowns in 7 games this year. What more do you want from a player who is a stable wide receiver 2 at this point? He's not Justin Jefferson. He's no longer the top option in this Vikings passing game. But in the red zone, the chemistry he has with Kirk Cousins, the amount of targets he gets in that area of the field, and the success rate he has with actually turning those targets into touchdown receptions has been very reliable. And we talked about this last year in terms of how his productivity when he was a under 1,000-yard player looked a little bit shaky and a little bit fluky. We projected that into this season. Adam Thielen's proved us wrong, gotten back in the high levels of touchdown productivity, and shown us he can keep that trend going into this year. So Adam Thielen might not be a flashy player, might not be the sexiest pick here, but he still makes the top 24 list. Marquise Brown is someone who I honestly want to have higher on this list, but having Bateman back in this offense is something I think that makes it hard to project Hollywood as a high wide receiver 2 the rest of the way this year. Marquise's production has been fantastic, and honestly, he really shouldn't even have a down game yet. His down performances have come as a result of him dropping passes, and that is quite literal. If Hollywood catches wide open footballs in the games where he had down performances, his worst 2 games of the season, he tacks on 40 or 50 yards at minimum with a touchdown reception. And in the case of the Lions game where he struggled in that one, you're talking about potentially 2 drop touchdown passes. So Hollywood could be sitting in a very different regard with some people if he just hauls in those passes. So I want to give him credit where it's due for those missed opportunities. They're self-inflicted errors nonetheless. The drops were his fault. They were catchable passes from Lamar Jackson. But getting back into this Ravens situation where, yes, they don't have their J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards. They're down basically all their top backs, and now you're into a committee-style running back system with a bunch of old heads who are veterans in this league and aren't necessarily at the top of their games. but this is still a run-first team. Lamar Jackson, the run game, getting those 3 running backs involved in a rotation and splitting carries up between them. They still want to play physical football and get the ball moving on the ground. Hollywood's going to get his shots. He's going to get multiple every game. That's something that's going to keep his ceiling in play here and keep that as a very legitimate and respect-worthy factor of his weekly outlook. But when you've got Bateman, a first-round pick who looks like he's going to take some major strides in this league over the back half of this season, you've got a top tight end in Mark Andrews, who's a very good red zone threat, and you have Lamar Jackson who can call his own number, I just start to see the floor regressing a little bit and seeing these high upside boom performances maybe dropping off a little bit down the stretch of this season. So I believe in Marquise Brown as a talent. I think he's a fantastic player. I just think that his own team's internal situation is what digs the most into his long-term fantasy value this season. And then finally, Tyler Lockett here. This is someone who I'm not seeing crack top 24 lists right now, but I think he deserves to be in that category. He's coming off of his best game of the season in the receiving yardage department and in the targets department. 13 targets, 12 receptions, over 140 receiving yards. Then you talk about Russell Wilson coming back for this team off of bye week in week 10 potentially. Now, worst case scenario here, you get Tyler Lockett with Russell Wilson back in week 11. You're giving me one of the best deep ball passers in the league, and yes, it's a throwing hand finger issue. Maybe Russ doesn't come back 100% ready to go on his top end performance week 1 out of the gates for Seattle. I still like this combo. Tyler had some rough patches with Geno Smith the first few weeks that they were together, but after that, you've got yourself the game of productive scoring. That was probably a saver for a lot of teams out there. You can make it through the bye week here, get Russ back, and I think that chemistry will click. It'll take over, and you'll get your upside back with Lockett. We know he's not a floor play. That's never something we projected for him this season. It's going to be upside. It's going to be fireworks. It's going to be fantastic points the rest of the way this season. I think Tyler Lockett deserves the respect of being in the wide receiver 2 conversation for the rest of this year. Alrighty, those were our top wide receivers for the rest of the 2021 NFL season. Let me know down in the comment section below your thoughts about today's video, any questions you've got, lineup advice, trades, whatever the case might be. If you got questions, we'll answer as many of yours as possible before we hit week 9 action on Sunday afternoon. So, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure to click that like and subscribe if you're new around here, and we'll see you guys next time. Peace out.